Back on Podcast Twins. I'm Vince. I'm
Yeah.
not Vince.
You
I'm
are
Drew.
the-
That's
you're-
Vince.
You're Vince's twin, though.
I am. That's
Yeah.
why I get it confused.
You even get it confused.
Well, my dad's middle name is Vincent, and my cousin, my nephew's name is Vince.
And my
So,
middle name is Andrew.
boom.
So there it is.
And
Look
we
at that.
have a
Yeah.
very special guest today, but I'm not qualified to introduce him because you used to work for this guy.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah,
your
no doubt.
job today,
Listen,
Vince.
we do. We have a very esteemed guest with us here today. Is my main man, Sam Eaton. He is going to come here today and kind of discuss a near and dear topic to us in the fire industry, which is how cancer has affected the firefighters in general. And now, as a retired chief, he's working harder now than he did when he was on shift, but out here for an even better cause. So, Sam, welcome to the show.
Brother Vince, thank you so much.
It's a
Drew.
pleasure to meet you,
Thank
Chief.
you. I feel like
Absolutely.
I'm up to speed on the podcast Twins.
you know.
I've been trying to catch up since you launched this thing and
Are you having fun
catch the
listening?
different.
That's
Oh,
the
I
first
am.
question.
I've gotten notes. I literally have notes in my phone on things I want to say about each podcast.
look at
So
that.
one
All
day,
right.
one day maybe we get into that. But right now, I think we stay focused on it. But Curfton, nice to meet you, sir. He's the man behind the thing here.
Yes,
So
the
it's
guy
good to-
behind the guy.
guy behind the
eye in
guy.
the sky right there. The eye
Absolutely.
in the
So
sky.
it's
So-
good to be here today.
And we're
Good.
drinking espresso, but we don't need any because
Nah.
Chief is fired up about
Fully
this
hyped
topic.
up.
So.
I am hyped.
But before he gets started, I want to remind everybody this is a good time to click that little subscribe button if you're watching us on YouTube and hit the little bell icon so you can get notifications of every episode and every little crazy idea that one of us gets in post. If you're in your vehicle, Spotify, you can find us on Podcast Twins. And trust me, you're going to want to have that follow so you don't want to miss anything that's coming.
All right.
Amen.
So, Brother Sam, tell me what's been going on with this agenda, man. You just had a big weekend with
We
the
did.
Dolphins. So
We
can
did.
you tell us a little bit about
We did.
that?
So we'll start there, and obviously we want to just jump right into it here. But what many people might not know, and those viewers, and we had a little conversation ahead of time, but cancer is the number one killer of firefighters,
Yes.
and people don't really understand that and understand why. They think, well, hey, isn't it heart? Isn't it lung? It's actually in the 70 percentile that the final disposition of a firefighter is cancer. And we're grateful here in the state of Florida that we finally recognize cancer as a job-related disease for the fire service, but it wasn't always so. And
That's what I was about to say. That's new.
it's only been since 2019. It sounds that's really new in the continuum, but we're the 48th state to finally get legislation in place that protects firefighters.
So if it's not lung cancer, what types of cancer is affecting firefighters?
so many.
It's
So-
a smattering of
It
everything.
is, and actually, our bill in the state of Florida covers 21 separate different cancers, male and female cancers, all kinds of. So, and those are based on studies that have shown that. So, and I love that you asked the question: if it's not lung, what is it?
Yeah.
Well, everything in this room, if you look around here, is woods, but there's also urethanes, there's plastics, there's electronics. Everything nowadays is made of petroleum products. And so when we go in on a structure fire, we're literally exposed to chemicals that in the legacy of fire service was never there before. And those fuels are liberated into the air. They get in our skin, they get in our respiratory tract, they stay on our equipment, and they continue to off gas. So even when we're not on the call, Vince will tell you, you'll be in a fire truck and go, hey, these guys caught a fire in the last couple of days. I can smell it. And that smell is not body sweat. It's not body odor.
No.
It's literally plastics that have been drugged back from the fire scene, and it's embedded in our equipment. So that constant nipping for 30, 40 years in the fire service continues to affect the health of that firefighter. And so that is why cancer is so high in the fire service.
Interesting.
That's crazy because, even one of the initiatives that when we came into this business many moons ago, it was a badge of honor to keep your gear dirty. You wanted your gear nasty, dirty. You wanted your helmet look like you've been through the wars. But since we through the FACE team years ago, we started the initiative of, hey, the new badge of honor is to be clean, and
And not get cancer.
Well,
or
because of-
have less of a chance,
and so
hopefully. of,
listen now. I mean, I my gear is so clean now. I look like a brand new rookie, and I'm not.
and I'm not.
But it is good because I definitely have recognized it. Because even early in my career, they used to say dress to the level of your officer. Well, after the fire was over, you had to go back in and do overhaul. What we do, rip off our air packs, our mask, our coats, and go do overhaul. When you come out of there, you blow your nose, it's black. And you've been sitting there just doing this for an hour after the fire. You were protected in the fire, but when you came out, you were exposed to all of that stuff. Chewing smoke is what they called it. Going there, chew the smoke.
So to Vince's point, because of the powerful messaging that is out there on what a firefighter is supposed to look like, this is embedded in the culture of the fire service. When you come on, your leaders have a charred helmet. They have dirty gear. They're rough. They're tough. It's a very masculine culture. It's one of those things that you can't be scared of anything. And rookies, when they get their gear, the very first thing they want to do is when they catch a fire is to make that gear look dirty and to season their helmet so they look like they're supervisors. And really what Vince said is, and one of the first things that the University of Miami, and we'll get into this this connection with Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center at the university, one of the first things they said is, we need to change that. We need to change the messaging. And he said it, clean is the new badge of honor. Now, it's going to take a while to steer this ship, and it's not there yet.
You're not flying a jet.
No,
sir. You're steering a cruise ship.
The Titanic.
Turning
the Titanic.
Well, there's tons of red tape because it's the government, right? The government has lots of red tape, no matter how you cut and slice it.
But this tape is personal. It's to the individual.
I understand.
It's to get that bold individual to say, I'm going to be the one to step out here and make a difference. That's where the difference comes.
So the supervisor has to lead by example, right? They can't. If the supervisor has a dirt everywhere and grime and a seasoned helmet, it doesn't look as this shiny one here, then the rookies follow the leader, right? I mean, this is not straightforward logic. If I don't have any straightforward logic, then right?
For me, being a vet, I don't give a damn what my supervisor does because he has no effect on me. You understand what I'm saying?
Okay.
He could be my captain, my chief. None of that. I've been around. I'm smart enough to understand to do it myself.
Yeah.
I'm more thinking about
the rookies are looking to
guys.
you.
So even for me, they looking at how I act, and how I function after a fire.
And you
maybe
just said
more
you look
so than the captain himself, because in our department, in every department, there are formal leaders that have risen to the rank. They got their badge, however they got their badge. And then in the station, I guarantee you, in the battalion, Vince was one of those informal leaders. If Vince goes, it makes it easier for the supervisor to lead. And those younger guys are going to say, hey, Vince is doing it, I need to do it. And it's so true. That dynamic is one of the most powerful things that we could have on our, and I'm grateful to have Vince on our team. Actually, to tell you the truth, Vince, I noticed that you didn't have your bracelet on, so I'm going to make sure that you have your
I
face
got one
bracelet.
too.
My face bracelet. Would you don me?
I will do that.
We got the face cancer
I got one for you, my
bracelets
brother.
here. All right, nice. Thank you.
So anyway, so carry on with that thought process. I got something else to say about it for sure.
No, I mean, listen, it's true. And I mean, as much as I like to grab ass like anybody else, but I know when it gets to that point when we get new guys in, it does probably follow my position more than the officers, because again, he's around me. The officer's off doing some other stuff. He's around me more. Or if an incident pops off, they say, hey, he's with you. So I have to, kind of watch out for these guys.
Lead by example.
It is that. So when you get off that fire, it's not like you used to do, take your stuff off, throw it in the truck. Now we swap out our neck gear, our hand gear, all of the stuff that we never thought about in the past. So if I don't go and exchange mine, what can I expect young rookie to do?
Right. Or like you said, the captain, who it makes it easier for the captain to, if everybody's doing it, the captain's going to embrace it if he didn't embrace it first.
So one thing about that, because again, with the he just
so much to unpack.
Because you take a test, and pass, it doesn't suddenly change who you are. So a lot of them don't have the confidence. They still look to other people with a stronger influence or personality.
As they should in some situations.
To lead. And so it just takes one person on that unit or that station to do the right thing, because it's easier for the others to just get in line. Again, that's what Sam was talking about. It really don't matter about the ranking at that point. It's just who takes the education and applies it and do it. Basically, like I tell you all the time, I'm a pimp it just like this. And you get out there and you do it with confidence, and next thing you know, other people are going to do the same thing. But in this case, it's helping us to make people healthier.
So I would say Vince probably wasn't always there.
Yeah.
I want to steer this thought process, because it's important that we get to what's on front of us in the table here. I wasn't always there. It took me a moment when I had the why.
Yes.
I think Vince. I think your why might have been James Howard.
James Howard.
James Howard. Young man in his 40s. Gets stricken with cancer. We connect with his wife. We start raising funds for him, and then just fast forwarding here. It didn't take long. He's in a hospice bed, and this is the moment for a lot of us that we recognize, hey, this is for real. This is really taking people from us. And you have his motorcycle.
I have his motorcycle.
You do, and so I think that would be your aha moment. I saw another one just a minute ago, but tell me about that, Vince.
So Jim came back to the station one day, and he went and had tests done because it was a nodule right on his leg.
Barbara, we're thinking about you.
Yes, love you, Barb. He rubbed the nodule on his leg, and he's like, I was sore. And so he went and had it checked out. Boom, came back. They thought the cancer was right there. Turns out it had moved.
It was all over.
It was moving. And so, like Sammy said, it went from the nodule testing to. So in this process, he went and bought this motorcycle. He was a Harley guy. The whole time I knew him, he had nothing but Harleys and big trucks. So he went and bought this brand new Harley at the time, the 2005 Harley that I have right now. That was his. He brought it to the station. He was so weak that he shouldn't have been driving it. And so, but he had just picked it up, brand new, brought it to the station. I was the first person to see him on the bike. Me and Natty, me and Larry.
Wow.
We standing outside. He pulls up. We saw him. We were the first two people to see him on the bike. And then as he got really sick, Bob, you weren't home. He jumped on the bike and came back up to the station.
Okay.
So we were also the last two to see him on the bike. And from that point was the last time he rode. And a month or so later, he was in hospice. And we were going to the hospital, checking in on him and doing all this other stuff. And, obviously it didn't end well. And he became on our list there. And so that was my personal moment of that. And then, just us keeping in contact over the years. And, and then Barbara reaches out and says, hey, you know what? I want you to have his bike, since as though you was the first and the last person to see him on that bike. And even when I want to clean out my garage, I can't sell it.
Yeah.
I can't. It's there.
Yeah.
So that was my guy. Wow. And he was my driver, man. He was the driver.
So and he's on this.
He is.
Yes. And you talked about a badge of honor. This like a memorial to all of the firefighters that you guys have lost.
So what's important about this, and I think it's very important right now to talk about it. This is a band, an honor band that we put together, and shorten the story here, but there was an opportunity to do this and actually run this up the state just before we got legislation in place. We strapped this to a guy named Bull that walked from Key West to Tallahassee, along the way collecting names of firefighters that had lost their life to cancer. What we wanted to show was this is the impact of one department. One fire department, and 90% of the people I worked with on this, Vince has worked with a number of them as well. Our first district chief is on here, Henry Cassell. One of our district chiefs here, Skip Mosier. We can walk down the list. Butch Smith is the first person I spoke to, and that got me motivated. And then just in this room, not 20 minutes ago, I was showing this to Vince, and he goes, "Wait a minute."
Yeah, I saw names on there that I didn't
Anderson?
know.
Yeah, he said
Aronson?
No,
I mean,
no.
Aronson didn't.
Aronson.
He passed away from cancer.
Yeah.
He did not know that he passed away. So
Yeah.
what I say to that moment is this. This is my first captain.
Mm-hmm.
That's my first district chief. That's my first captain for Palm Beach County Fire Rescue. It was his as well.
That's my first.
And he just found out just now by looking at this band, and that's why this band is so important, not just to show other outside agencies or other people to show the impact, but even to our own people.
Yeah.
You're not a walking computer. You don't know how many people. There's 34 on this thing, and this thing continues to, I take things off to put people on here, sadly. But these are firefighters in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, some in their 60s, but this is an impact that one department has suffered. This has 34 on it. Miami-Dade is 140 deep. 140 deep.
Crazy.
The reason why it's not longer is that we're a baby department.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're only 40 years old. City municipalities are like 125, 150 years old actually. West Palm I think is 150.
150.
And because of the legacy or the length of that time, more and more firefighters would be represented there. But this is just one brand new young baby adolescent fire department, and the impact of district chiefs, captains, driver operators, paramedics, and firefighters.
Wow.
And I use this tool when I'm speaking to our own people to say, hey, what I'll do is, Drew, I'll say, do you know one person that's passed from cancer from Palm Beach County? Everybody raises their hand.
Nobody doesn't say yes
Right?
to that,
Do
unfortunately.
you know two? Do you know
anymore.
three?
Yeah.
Do you know five? And about 3 or 4, they all put their hands down, Vince. And I say, do you know 10? Do you know 15? Do you know 20? From Palm Beach County Fire Rescue, do you know 30?
Yeah.
Do you know 35?
And people
do you
still
know
have
34?
their
And
hands
they're
up.
looking at me like, there's no way. And I go, look.
Yeah.
There
And
it is.
so if you need that as a why to make sure that you do what you're supposed to after fire, whatever it takes to help you understand that this is for real. For every one person here, Vince, there's probably in our department 20 or 30 that have fought or are fighting
Yes.
a cancer diagnosis right now.
Right now.
So that's the truth of it. This is only a low percentage of those that are actually impacted by cancer, the ones that actually lost their life.
Yeah.
So it's a powerful tool.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking here, there. I'm looking at Skip Mosier. I'm still in touch with his family, his daughter and his wife. I talk with them a couple times a year. He retired as my district chief, and you know they said I gave him a personality, but because he really was he was a hard ass dude,
Yeah,
man.
he was.
But,
Yeah, he
but
was.
I kind of got to him, and you know whatever. But either way, I'm still in touch with the family, and you know. But I see another name there that strikes a chord with the timing of our legislation going through. Steve Wilbur.
Absolutely.
He was our first.
He was the first person that was underneath the new regulations for the state, and he actually was able to receive benefits, thankfully. We'd fought for 17 years,
Yes.
Vince. Our state fought for 17 years to get what other states had, and finally the 48th state in 2019, we got 21 cancers covered, and that moving forward, it wasn't retro. It
Right.
never was retro.
Never.
But moving forward, firefighters with anyone getting those 21 cancers would have an opportunity to get some decent support and the ability to get treatment and be able to be off duty and not lose their time to
And he
fight
was
cancer.
at my station when he went out.
Before we get into your efforts to raise money for cancer research with UM, tell us about the helmet first before we get into that.
This helmet is very much like this, but this is the state of Florida. And
Okay.
these crosses that are on the helmet are representative of firefighters that have lost their life to cancer. When I got this helmet, it was completely white. There was nothing else on it. It's showing weathered. I leave it. I don't protect this helmet. It's not in my nature to do so, meaning that I feel like it has battle scars, and it does. I have very, very clear battle scars from being around, and one of which is this one cross underneath here that was rubbed raw. This is Mike Sweeney's cross, and this was rubbed raw when it walked from Palm Beach County's line all the way to Tallahassee as people carried it back and forth, carrying it like this. It rubbed that cross raw. I went ahead and replaced Mike Sweeney's cross here, but I left this in place because it shows the connectivity to one of the biggest legislative moves in the state of Florida back in 2018.
His son works for us now.
He does,
kidding.
there's so many stories, but Ryan Sweeney is one of our champions for the cancer prevention.
Yes,
He's actually one of our instructors now that teach the recruits.
Sweeney dog.
But on this helmet are these are the first two crosses on here. This is Tim Monahan. And Tim Monahan is the one that made this helmet. He made these in retirement. He had a business making these derbies, and he said it was his last helmet he made. He was fighting cancer, and he passed away. Before he passed, he got this helmet to Butch Smith. This is Butch, the guy that got me started. He's on the inside of this, on the inside of here in the picture, in the photograph. Butch gave this helmet to me, and he said, "Sammy," Tim said, "you need to have this with you every time you talk about cancer."
And you have it with
and
you
I have
every
had
time
it
you
every
talk
single
about
time
cancer.
it has been with me. It was down in Miami just recently. It walked the entire Dolphins Cancer Challenge with me. It's always with me. The only time it hasn't been with me is when it walked the state with the group, the entourage with Bull, and I thought that was an important move there. So that's
And
what
he
the
walked
state,
from Key West to Tallahassee.
Key West to Tallahassee.
As in, if I drove that, it would be 10 or 11 or 12 hours, and
certainly.
he walked it.
He walked it. He walked it. He went.
And his
through-
name is Bull.
His name is the Bull. And
I
he was-
freaking love this guy already.
You should look him up. Tom Bull Hill.
Yes.
Bull, you are the man.
Yes.
He's from Orange County Fire Rescue.
That's where I
And
started.
The story is, he had two guys that lost their life to cancer, and he watched them in hospice beds say, "This is what absolutely torqued him off." They looked at Bull independently. They didn't know. They both said to him, "I'm embarrassed that I chose the fire service. I'm not leaving my family with anything."
Wow.
And he said, "That's not right. Why is our state so behind the ball?" So he goes to the Key West. He takes a pack. He has their helmet shields in it, one backpack, and he starts walking.
crazy.
And he gets on social media. This guy's older than me, and he's on social media. He's like Jesus. He looks like he has his long ass hair, and he's walking
Looks like
by
Forrest Gump
himself.
when Forrest Gump did his walk.
By himself, and he got on social media, and he started raising some clatter, and he was not going to hold back. He didn't hold back nothing. And by the time he got to Miami, city of Miami, Miami-Dade, those brothers down there met him at the line as he came out of the Keys, and they said, "We got you, man."
Oh, that's so
And they
cool.
started walking up the
Okay.
state, and they stopped along the way, and they picked up badges and PATs, and some people brought the ashes of firefighters that had lost their life to cancer. By the time he got
my
to
God.
Tallahassee, he had something like 12 packs.
Yeah.
Went from one backpack to 12 packs. He had guys carrying packs with him. They got the helmet. They got this band at the county line, and they walked the state. And when we walked into Tallahassee, brother, they tried to say, "You got to stay on the sidewalk." That was the funniest thing. We're not staying on the sidewalk.
Stand on sidewalk.
You are they had to shut down that road. We had 1,500 people. Cassell's family was there with us as Jacqueline and his son walked into Tallahassee, and you should see the picture. And that was the thing that really shook this state and finally put us in a scenario where we could say, hey, this matters. Not one legislator that year voted against. It was a unanimous decision to give firefighters what they rightfully deserved.
You obviously did
Those
something
protections.
right, because you can't get those idiots to agree on anything.
It was
So
true.
that's
Both
impressive.
sides of the aisle. Both
That's
sides of the aisle.
impressive.
I would say
The only other thing they've ever agreed on is that they wanted to ban TikTok. That's it. They've literally agreed twice now.
I want to say that they were probably scared not to vote because
Right.
the firefighters are pretty powerful legislatively. So
Well, they probably wanted somebody to put their fire out if they ever had a fire, right? I mean, isn't that the whole point?
that too, but they also know that we know how to get out and wave some signs and stuff. And
we'll hold some signs.
Was there any?
they tried to quiet him down. They tried to say, "Hey, hey, Bull, when you come into this county and the city, just try to calm your. Try not to be so, it was like
Nah.
they wanted you to sugarcoat stuff.
He was not sugarcoating
Oh,
nothing.
that's gross. Yuck.
You imagine how pissed off you got to be to decide to walk the entire
He
state.
never
Well,
changed his
Vince and I
message.
have this podcast because we're not good at sugarcoating stuff. So you could say anything you
I
want
heard.
here, man.
I heard
You can
myself.
say anything you want here.
Things
Sam.
are, it's big, man. But I tell you what, this initiative See, we worked together, and so and so when he started turning his corner, and look, man, I was a single guy back then, man, and so where we talking about raising money, we got poker tournaments going on. They hoard me out on some single dates.
Yes, we did a speed dating thing.
Speed dating, I was hoarded out.
That was the
times.
South Florida Fire Fest. We had dominoes, we had speed dating, we were doing anything we could to raise awareness
money.
about this,
Okay.
but also raise some funds to support benevolent and try to give our guys some support. That was early on. That's back in 2007, 2008. Yep.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that was the good times though. It was fun, man. But that was so Sammy was, because as you can see, he can be very persistent. Okay, what I need you to do is, come on, man. I need. So all right, man. Let's go.
So what kind of?
But we started doing that stuff early, and all the way up to and through distributing different type of soaps at the station, so you can have it for
better soaps,
for bathing after
decontaminating after a fire, special
stuff. Things we never thought about. I mean, I used to come in early and we would boom and come sit around the table for hours before you even go and shower, because you're gonna talk about it because you was excited. So it has
After the
changed
fire.
our behavior.
I love it.
Because now they even give us time off an hour to go back and clean up because of these initiatives, because they know that, hey, look, you got to get out of those clothes.
So what was the state's like pushback before they gave you guys what you were asking
Money.
for?
They didn't want to give it up.
They kept saying, show us the science. And we're like, why do we have to show you science that's already there? They felt like Florida was different than any other state.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well,
Because it's not as hot as everywhere else?
It doesn't make any sense. We can't make any sense of it. Never made sense. And that's why we have what we have today.
Okay.
One of the stories that I definitely want to get to, but I don't want to minimize what we were talking about here.
No, go
this
ahead.
is the impact, and this actually leads us to the why. We were very coordinated, and our department we started looking at this stuff, and there were a number of initiatives that were going on at the same time. In about 2013, because of the poker tournaments and all the things that I had been involved in, somebody came to me and said, "Hey, listen, we want to start a cancer prevention team in the fire department, and we would like you to chair it." And I'm like, me? And they go, yeah, who else? And I go, I love the idea, but I gotta have a team. There's no way I can do it by myself. And we created, my first phone call was Vicki Shepard. My next phone call was Bob Kropa.
Okay.
And the reason for
Smart
that, first three people, myself, Vicki was the first person. Vicki Shepard she's a machine. And her father passed from cancer, and she was the first person I ever heard speak about firefighter cancer. So I wanted her interest in it. I wanted her to co-chair. And our next pick was a guy named Bob Kropa, who was University of Miami alumni. He was Butch Smith's, the guy that handed me the helmet. It was Butch Smith's driver operator. He was the guy that was helping Butch get down to University of Miami and made the connection for him for treatment. And he's also had a biochemistry background.
Yeah.
So here's a guy that
Like a
literally is
genius.
just genius level, and I needed somebody to study us. And so that turned into what's considered, and Vicki named us, we went through a thing, but the Firefighters Attacking the Cancer Epidemic. Okay. And that was our FACE team. And we had that FACE team for about 8 months. This is OG right here, brother. This is literally, this is from 10 years ago. And this face bracelet, and
is the poker tournament still in play?
It is different. It's a little bit different
because I
now,
think
but it is
Herfton
still
and I,
there.
between the two of us, can bring at least 20 people
I love
more
it.
than whatever you had.
We
You got new blood coming in this year.
We need to talk about that for sure. But why that's important is this: we were the only department in South Florida that had an actual team, and there we found out that the University of Miami was going to be doing Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center was going to start studying firefighter cancer. And the guy that told me was a guy named Keith Tyson. I said, Keith, can you get Bob Kropa in that meeting? He goes, aren't you going to come? I said, I don't need to be there. Bob needs to be there. I keep hitting my mic probably.
Yeah, it's okay.
Sorry. Bob needs to be there because Bob can talk that language. He knows it. So we sent Bob Kropa down there to meet with Sylvester, and they heard we had a team. They drove all the way from Miami in December of 2013 to meet with us and connect, 2014, to connect with us and launched what's considered now the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. That's not just a statewide initiative, but it's also national.
So you did the Dolphins Cancer Challenge, you got your poker tournament. How else are you raising money? Like, what other types of events? What should we be on the lookout for so we can share it with our
It's
our
so
people?
far past raising money specifically for the initiative. What we're working right now is working with scientific institutions across the United States, and specifically Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, to create prevention standards that will save lives.
Okay.
The money raising is absolutely, it's pivotal.
Important
It's
still,
important
yeah.
to the stuff, but that being said, we do work with Sylvester as a nonprofit institution, and the Miami Dolphins embraced Sylvester 15 years ago and started raising. All the money for the Dolphins Cancer Challenge goes to that. So we just got off we just left last week, Thursday, Friday, the International Cancer Symposium, which brings firefighters and scientists from across the nation and across the globe. Actually, there were firefighters from all over Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and of course across the United States. Brings them all together, and also scientists from globally together to talk about the science and talk about the prevention standards that we're setting forth. And then as a fundraising thing on Saturday after that, every year, the Miami Dolphins have raised, I think it's well over $50 million for cancer research, specifically for Sylvester, and helping them to literally fund a lot of the science that we're talking about that helps us understand why it's important to wipe up after a fire, why it's important to have a cleaner cab, why it's important to have a shower within the hour, why we need new gear and new innovations, and also early recognition, so that James Howard finds that problem 2 years before it becomes a problem for him. We need all of those things, and it's such a machine. So many things going on with it, but it's just an opportunity. It's an honor, honestly, to get the word out about this to everybody.
You know, we here at the Podcast Twins have been in a roundabout sort of way actually doing our own version of cancer prevention, because we've been trying to get people to quit eating this garbage with all the sugars and all this other stuff, all this preservatives and all these other dyes and all this stuff. Hey, you eat whole foods. That takes care of the body on the inside, at least gives it the best chance possible. And then for us to turn around and do the things that he was talking about doing on the outside, you know, you do the combination of things like that, and that's part of what we here talk about. There is no subject off with us, so we talk about this stuff because this is real.
You know, at the crux of this, it's good that people are making changes, just like we talk about, you know, Vince just talked about making changes to our diet or our exercise routine. You know, there's a lot of professions, not just firefighters. Like, I mean, I remember casino workers would all get lung cancer, right? Because they were working in a smoke-filled environment. So, or bartenders, right? Before they did the indoor clean air thing.
Right.
You know, and it wasn't just for the government only; it was for the rest of us too.
I remember ashtrays in aircraft, by the way.
Oh yes,
Right,
sir.
right.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Smoking sections.
Can you
at the
imagine
restaurant?
what would happen if someone lit a cigarette on an airplane? There'd be an international incident.
Yes,
Right
it
down
would
the
be.
spot.
It would be.
Yeah.
Down the spot.
It's
And
crazy,
I remember
right?
my mom was a cigarette smoker, and had I'm like, Mom, we're gonna be on the smoking section of the plane. I'm like, but you know, the plane it's all together.
The whole plane is the
plane.
smoking
Yeah,
section.
yeah.
Don't get me started on masks, but anyway.
It was amazing, man.
That's for a next episode then. If you want to get started on that, we can.
We have definitely been around
It's just
to
you
see
look
the
at
changes,
it, right?
And it's the same thing we talk about within our years in the fire service. It's the changes that you've seen from the time when we came out, when they didn't even talk to you when you got to the station, to now when you get out here now, you're so well taken care of by the time you put boots on the ground. It's an utterly amazing thing to see. And even now, the initiatives like this or you know, and what we talk about, laugh and joke, is about even them doing paperwork versus tablets. You know, they don't feel the pain of what it was like to do reports back then, being up all night.
3 or 4 in the hole.
You know, but it's all changing for the better, you know. And so we ribbed them about it, but the truth is that we're glad that these changes are happening, because our goal is, if you retire, I tell them all the time, I want them to knock on my door 35 years from now and be like, damn, he's still alive? We want to make sure we're sending the money to the right place.
Absolutely.
That's right. Make sure it gets there, because I'm still here breathing. And that's what the whole issue is. And so that's why we're not holding back, trying to educate our new people coming into the field, because they are getting younger and younger coming in now. Because now you got high school programs. These kids are graduating high school. All they got to do is wait till they turn 18 and they can go take the state exam and get hired.
So to that point, and that's really, I just want to talk about this, touch on this a little bit, is that we advanced this initiative on firefighter cancer, the FACE team, not just from a department standpoint, but we actually pushed into a statewide team. We connected with a group called the Florida Firefighters Safety and Health Collaborative. They're represented on the band. The colors here come from that organization, and we're not just a department FACE team, but we're a statewide and national FACE team. We have connections and influences. Other departments in the state of Florida have taken up that brand, well, just like we wanted, and then we have departments throughout this. There's places throughout the United States that also have taken on the FACE brand. And we were just speaking about this last week. The importance there is when they saw our connectivity statewide, we were able to work with the State Fire Marshal's Office, the State Fire College, and we built curriculum to teach firefighters when they first started into this culture, exactly what we're talking about.
Yes.
They get 4 hours of cancer prevention training and 4 hours of mental wellness training that they would never got before. And part of our thing that we do with our recruits now, and Vince has been there for this, and we talked about Ryan Sweeney and Neil Nimchek and Mike McKeon and the instructors at the Fire Academy. When they come in, they get an overview of this stuff. Imagine the impact.
Yeah.
You know, when you're taught that when you first start, hey, this is just as big, if not bigger, of an exposure to you, and possibly could lead to your death as a fire a backdraft, a flashover, a collapse, a car accident. You could more readily die from cancer or your exposure to that as well. So teaching them on the front side, the impact down the road is going to have huge positive ramifications for health and safety.
I mean, I love the fact that you guys are on the cancer prevention side of things. I mean, it's because you know, who knows if we'll have an actual real cure in the next 1,000 years or whatever. Hopefully we do, but what is it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Is that the saying?
That is
something
the
like
saying.
that. So sounds like you keep doing what you're doing. How do we get involved? Like, tell our audience how, if we want to help your cause, how do we get involved?
There's a lot of ways. One at the local level, understanding this and being aware of the fact that firefighters have these risks. It could change the way we do business. Maybe it's something that where we need to get outfitted a little bit, take a little bit more time to make sure that we're properly protected as we're going to a call. If those response times slow a little bit, be understanding that we're trying to take care of ourselves and make sure that we're ready for what
Well, if all you guys are dead, we're screwed.
It's
so
true.
that's valuable,
So
right? I mean, like not to be too blunt or anything,
Absolutely.
but
That felt morbid.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. We're front line to everything,
he said he was
and we
a
have
straightforward, blunt guy. I'm returning the courtesy.
We have to
here.
take care of ourselves so that we can continue to take care of the public.
That's
right?
a better.
So,
that's a more articulate way to say it.
But I know exactly where you're going with that. The other thing too is that's a legislative side. So when you see these things come up, understand the duress that firefighters are under regarding cancer, but also mental wellness and things of that nature. Being aware of the fact that first responders are in a different realm from that standpoint. They're constantly exposed to these mental traumas and also chemical hazards and things of that nature, in addition to what we already know is the dangers. And then looking for organizations you can support. Our Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative is a nonprofit organization. FloridaFirefighterSafety.org. FloridaFirefighterSafety.org is a way for you to assist our organization in these statewide initiatives. But there's resources on there. It's not just a self-serving organization. We share everything. We're talking about not reinventing the wheel, Val. We're looking at we have policies and procedures and SOGs so firefighters can go there and say, hey, Kay, I want to get started on this. What should I do? Well, here's a policy on hood swap. Here's a cancer policy. Here's something you can look at regarding to making your cab a little bit cleaner, or maybe even fully clean cab. There's all these resources on there that we put together on that to share, and it talks about what we're doing there. So that's one way. And of course, the University of Miami Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. Look that up. That's a great way to get involved and also support an organization, an institution that's literally doing groundbreaking research and helping us with prevention standards.
It's pretty
and
cool
all
stuff.
of that will be linked in the comments. So
well, thank you.
Linked and pinned in the comments. So all of that will be there.
All right.
Listen, this is real. This is, like our biggest thing now is second set of gear. Because if we go through a fire right now, I'm going to be wet for at least the remainder of that shift, and probably when I come back in 3 days, it'll still be dead.
Why are you wet, Vince? Why are you wet? Because we make sure we clean our gear, or just from the general job itself. There's water around us all the time because the water puts out fire, and then we also sweat. So the gear's wet.
Car accident happens an hour after the fire. You got to put that gear back on and go back out there and do it. So it's second sets. It's more than something that would be nice. It's actually
essential.
It's essential.
And right now you do not have that.
We do not.
Now, if
it's an expense because, again, we do have 1,800 people in the field.
Right.
So we understand the expense of it. But the necessity of protecting our longevity, in my opinion, is priceless.
100%.
So if we stop wasting money and sending it, hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, we might be able to afford a couple firefighter uniforms.
We could take a fraction.
I'm just asking a question.
Listen, man.
It's just a question. Simple question. I didn't say anything offensive. I just
take care
asked.
of the people within. Are we going first? Are we going there?
I'm just asking a question.
We're gonna save that for his next
It's just
episode.
a question, Vin.
Listen.
All I did was ask a question. That's
Vince,
it.
did you know?
But you didn't answer the question, though.
No, it's not necessary. It's rhetorical.
It's not rhetorical. I don't ask rhetorical questions.
Yes,
I don't know that much. I have to ask.
However we can reallocate money that makes sense to where it makes sense is absolutely what we should be doing. We should look at these things and make sure that those things are in place. And honestly, if you look at it, departments that haven't spent any money over the last 10, 15, 20 years on this initiative have saved an enormous amount of money, and they should look at that and say, you know what, we've saved enough. Let's go ahead and put it back into our people. Did you know that that Australian Fire Service on entry are issued 3 sets of gear? This is what stinks about being connected internationally and hearing what Europe does, what other countries do for their firefighters, and we only have 1 set. It's just insane. And we're not the only department, and we have a department that's looking to move a different direction, which is called gear delivery. That being said, it is something that is necessary for our departments, and absolutely any firefighter should have access to clean gear after a fire. 100%. That should be the first thing that we should be doing.
Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, that doesn't, as a guy on the outside, right? I never was a firefighter. I do like to smoke meat and cigars and drink bourbon. So Vince told me I could come hang out anytime I want.
Well, you'd fit right in.
So,
but not on shift.
My closest experience was I was a professional firearms instructor for 3 years at the second largest civilian training school in the country, and everybody I worked with had some kind of letters, right? They were either a firefighter, FBI, CIA, Army Ranger, Marine Corps, you name it, they had it, right? So I was just learning from the best of the best.
Did you guys clean up from the heavy metals that were all over your hands?
So first of all, we were outside because it was a 500-acre facility in Vegas, outside of Vegas.
That's good.
But so when I got home, now I drove an hour, but when I got home, my clothes went directly into the washing machine. So, and I did have multiple uniforms.
Good.
So, and we worked kind of 4 days in a row. It was like a Thursday to Sunday thing.
Did you have the soaps?
We did not. No, you know what? We did. They did give us good charcoal, like legitimate soap in the washrooms.
Good.
They were portalettes, right? Because we're out in the middle of the desert.
some of the same mechanisms that are in place for firefighters to get heavy metals off of their skin are literally directed right to the fire.
And I gotta tell you though, the bonfires were my favorite part of that job.
Always.
Because I didn't have a single good story compared to those guys, right? Like I thought I had some funny stories or some entertaining stories.
Everybody loves a good bonfire.
I said I was quiet.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, Vince knows me well enough to know that's unrealistic.
The stories were damn good.
Stories were damn good.
Yeah.
So.
But that's good, man. This is what it's about, and this is exactly why when we launched, I can't remember what episode. No, we hadn't even launched it. We recorded something here, and I got right out in my car and I said, I gotta have Sam. I gotta have Sam, and I texted him before I even left the premises here, and you know, y'all gotta know my guy. He's high energy. So when he saw that at first, he was like, "Yeah, you know, I'm busy." I was like, "No. I need you to come on here and talk about the initiative."
It's good.
He was like, "I'm dropping every damn thing. I will be there. You tell me when and where." And for that, brother, we are grateful to have you here, man.
And we're bringing them back
amazing.
too. We're definitely bringing back, Sammy.
That's awesome.
I appreciate you, man.
Because this is not a one subject, one day topic.
And we got more to talk about with him anyway.
Yeah. So listen. My guy, Sam Eaton, he's been my dude since the day I walked into the department, man. Great dude. I appreciate him. And in retirement, he's still my dude. I can't catch up with him to golf, but we're going to work it out, man. And we're going to make it happen. So,
and invite Drew.
Absolutely.
And invite Drew. And maybe even Kirk.
We got to work with the eye in the sky schedule, too.
Perfect.
But anyway, man, thanks for coming down here and gracing the podcast, twins.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to talk about these honored fallen and really the impact that cancer's had on the fire service. It can't be compressed in 30, 45 minutes, but I think we did a pretty good job.
Completely our pleasure, Sam. Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate you, man.
Welcome to the team.
We'll catch you back on Podcast Twins next week.
All right, brother.